Feminist art emerged in the very early 1970s. It was characterized by, among many attributes, collaboration. The image you are looking at is of members of the AIR Gallery. It was the first women's co-op founded in New York City in 1972. Feminism entered into a cultural milieu that exalted the lone genius. Its innovations, such as group authorship, challenged the very foundations of advanced art. I'm completing a book entitled An Army of Lovers Cannot Fail, A History of the Women's Movement in Art in the 1970s. It tells the story of how movements of social protest in North America and Europe empowered the feminist movement, which in turn, in many ways, not all of them fully understood, transformed the art of our time. Most of you know the history of modernism from its beginnings in the 19th century, throwing aside the traditions of the past in a spirit of experimentation, and challenging art's deceptions such as verisimilitude, its bourgeois conceptions of ownership. Art, in dialogue with previous art, could be seen as undergoing a process of purification, concentrating ever more on form alone. Under the sway of what became known as formalism, by the late 1960s, contemporary art existed in a kind of idealized vacuum. At the same time, the climate in Europe and in the United States was one of social protest, demonstrating for civil rights, agitating against the Vietnam War, and what was called the military-industrial complex. While artists were increasingly engaged in leftist politics, for the most part, political content did not find its way into art. Although the intellectual difficulty of formalist art, its refusal of the seductions of storytelling and representation, were seen as a political act in itself, a defiance of the marketplace. Civil rights, Black power, gay liberation, the struggles for labor, and Latino and labor rights all had erupted in the 1960s. By the end of this string of liberation movements, women began to realize that they too were a group that might need liberating, an unthinkable notion. Student radicals' girlfriends had been relegated to typing memos and serving coffee. It was universally held that by their very nature, women wished to bear children, nurture, and serve. For a woman to have ambitions was viewed as manly. What is the position of women in SNCC? Radical student leader Stokely Carmichael was asked. The position of women in SNCC is prone. Perhaps because culture was viewed by US society as a feminine activity, male artists felt particular pressure to adopt a virile pose, repressing any attributes that might seem too gentle, including often excluding in female colleagues. What were known as minority artists were also left out of the mix. In the 1960s, even the enlightened were known to believe that Black artists came from a different culture, impeding them from understanding Western art. Nonetheless, New York and European painters and sculptors saw themselves as in pursuit of greater truths and occupying a higher moral ground. It was difficult for them to perceive that they too might be acting unfairly, enacting an oppression identical to that of the bourgeois capitalist forces they saw themselves in opposition to. In 1969, War, Women, Artists, and Revolution, the first women's liberation art-related group, emerged and began meeting in downtown New York. This was an incredibly brave act. The women involved were ridiculed. They met to raise consciousness, as it was called, a round-robin process where members shared their experiences uninterrupted, which led to spontaneous revelations about how torments they had experienced in isolation were really part of being a class, that is, woman. The women in War had a sense that things were unfair, but there was no measure. They undertook research. They discovered that only 1 in 20 artists in major New York galleries was female, a far worse ratio than they expected. At the time, women made up more than half the student bodies in art schools. At the Museum of Modern Art, only 1 or 2 exhibitions had focused on a female artist since the museum's founding. In the outside world, this novel demand for rights, at first known as women's liberation, was starting to be called feminism. New concepts began to be explored, a questioning of what had seemed eternal principles, that males were inherently stronger, more intelligent, that women longed to nest, were inherently attracted to pretty things, that housework was the domain they were suited for, that they would feel unfulfilled without having children. Competition, domination, violence, war, seen as part of the human condition, were newly interpreted potentially as male characteristics. Perhaps there were other qualities associated with women's experiences: cooperation, collaboration, a horizontal rather than a pyramid organizing principle that might be the keys to creating a harmonious new world. In the 1960s, Black Power had proclaimed that Black is beautiful, taking values associated with negritude, notably dark skin color itself, exalting in qualities rejected by society in an act of defiance. Feminists began a similar project, and artists influenced by the women's movement posed the question whether qualities and materials deemed negatives, in women's case, the domestic, the decorative, the merely pretty, might be positives. The 1950s and 60s art world valued high seriousness, the large scale, the tough. Critic Clement Greenberg would denigrate artists he didn't like by calling them interior decorators. In the spirit of Black is Beautiful, some female artists began to experiment with materials associated with domesticity, that dread realm. Miriam Shapiro was a successful New York painter when, following a personal epiphany, she ended up launching a feminist art program in Los Angeles alongside firebrand Judy Chicago. From being a tough-as-nails abstract artist, she began taking materials that a year earlier she would have found trivial: wallpaper patterns, quilts, handkerchiefs, showing the similarities in their abstract patterning with abstract art. In addition to seeking out a new personal language, she saw this new direction as an homage to her own mother, whom she had long belittled in favor of her designer-politician father, with whom she had identified professionally. Other artists were embarking on similar projects. Joyce Kozloff examined Navajo blankets and Persian rugs, incorporating their patterns in abstract paintings. This was not simply a matter of appropriating motifs, it was a radical defiance of formalism itself and its dismissal of non-Western, non-white, non-male creations. Elaine Rychek's Laura's Layette, dedicated to her first child, showed, among other insights, how knitting is linked to a rigorous grid as exacting as a Sol LeWitt drawing or Agnes Martin painting. Harmony Hammond took rags given to her by women friends and made assemblage out of them, understanding this act as incorporating her beloved friends in artworks, creating sculptures she called bags. In society, women's work was beginning to be reevaluated. The artist Mierle Ukeles in 1969, after getting a BA in International Relations from Barnard and an MA from the University of Colorado, suddenly found, following the birth of her first child, that people's attitudes towards her changed. "I was put in this box," she said, "of mothers with children, as if they already knew everything about me." In addition, with household demands upon her, she no longer had time to make art, so she decided she would have to call what she did every day art. In the declarative tones of 1960s Marxism, she wrote a manifesto for maintenance art. "Two basic systems," she wrote, "development and maintenance. While part of life was creating, the other part involved maintaining. The spitball of any revolution, who cleans up the next morning?" In 1973, at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Connecticut, the artist performed maintenance art activities, mopping the floors, polishing vitrines. In an additional act, she requested that for an hour each day, all work done by the exhibition gallery's maintenance staff, with their awareness, be considered art. Modern art, or modernism, could be seen as engaging in a reductivist march. Abstract expressionism of the 1950s had done away with the image. Minimalism had reduced art to its simplest shapes and materials. Conceptual art, which became such a dominant approach in the 1960s and early 1970s, had dematerialized art, reduced it to pure idea. For example, some of Sol LeWitt's conceptual works consisted primarily of instructions so that the same piece could be created by anybody, anywhere. It could have an arbitrary quality to it. In Vito Acconci's following piece, Vito Acconci's from the Bronx, as was Mierle Ukeles, Executed daily over 1 month in 1969, the artist tailed a randomly chosen stranger through the streets of New York until he or she entered a private location. What was the goal of Akanchi's active following spectators? Nothing that could be discerned. Female artists gave conceptual art a goal, often as satire or critique, applying a feminist lens. In fully automated Nikon, object, objection, objectify, Laurie Anderson one June day in 1973, following months of the kind of frustration all attractive young women are subject to, took her camera and photographed men on the street who whistled, catcalled, or made boorish remarks to her. There were 9 that particular day, whom she displayed in a row of photos, their eyes blacked out like perpetrators in a police lineup. The title of this talk is The Impact of Feminist Theory on Contemporary Art. In fact, particularly during the 1970s, early 1970s, theory in this domain virtually didn't exist. Women stumbled forward, groping their way amidst the tumult of ideas coming forth. The art they made was pragmatic, ironic, at times full of rage. But insights were everywhere about subliminal messages given to women by advertisements, about power, about sex and violence. Ana Mendieta was Cuban-born, part of the Peter Pan generation. She left Cuba at age 12, growing up in the American Midwest. She was attending the University of Iowa when, in 1973, a nursing student there was raped on canvas. In response, she staged a series of bloody rape tableaus. In one, viewers entered a room through a door left ajar to confront a young woman, Mendieta herself, bent over a bed, naked from the waist down. She was surrounded by blood. She didn't move, staying in position about an hour. It really jolted them, the artist recalled, recounting that the audience spontaneously sat down and afterwards started talking about what the tableau meant, their feelings about the rape that had occurred. Such performances raising consciousness about a socio-political condition or issue were relatively new in 1973, when art still consisted primarily of painting and sculpture. Even the installation was a novel form. The personal is political, the radical group Red Stockings proclaimed. Women had served as painters, models, and muses, but now were using themselves as their own art material, artist and subject, simultaneously, with full consciousness that they were doing so. Relatively early on, Mendieta began to develop visually powerful works fused with archaeological overtones and sacred traditions such as Santeria. A haunting series of earthworks made between 1973 and 1980 she described as, quote, cave-like silhouettes which I've been carving in land formations. In some, she filled in the contour of her body with rocks, twigs, flowers, blood, or gunpowder, or covered her body with moss blended into the ground, resembling an ancient grave. You know, the other thing that happened at that time was that it began to be clear as things progressed that the body was the site of the kind of difference between men and women. And a lot of women began to deal with the body directly as sort of speaking about these issues of not just gender, but the origins of gender. This is Hannah Wilke, who you know, was a well-known body artist in the United States. Okay. Yeah, she made little sort of vagina-shaped pieces of gum and put them around on her body. You know, castration anxiety. A lot of artists were turning to Freudian ideas, and this whole idea of, you know, kind of castration anxiety was something that women were sort of making fun of a little bit. So Valley Export created this outfit called genital panic action pants. So they were leather trousers that had the kind of like the crotch cut out of them, so you had to see the, you know, in castration anxiety, the idea is that the male is traumatized by seeing the woman without the phallus, just which he perceives as a wound or lack, and that's there, you know, there it was. So there were a lot of riots that occurred because of when she wore this. Taking things and turning them in the opposite direction, Carolee Schneemann was also a performance artist that had worked in the Fluxus movement of the 1960s and did a lot of body art, naked, you know, at work at that time. But with feminism, she began to take the themes that she had used earlier that had to do with sexuality as a healing force and began to look at it from a feminist point of view. And her idea was that the vulva was the source of power, and that, that she saw it, she wrote a lot about the vulva as kind of both masculine and feminine, and kind of linking it to elements of, in a way like Ana Mendieta, to the earth, kind of archaeological themes. And in this piece, she actually, the vulva is the site of knowledge, let's say. And in this piece called Interior Scroll, she actually extracted a long text from her vagina and then read it. Faith Ringgold was another very interesting artist that was very important in bringing consciousness to the fact that women and blacks were left out of the dialogue, and she did a lot of very important feminist work early on. This was a piece that she did at the women's prison called at Rikers Island in New York City. Also really important in the whole feminist trend was an artist called Judy Chicago. And one of the ideas that was coming into the fore at that time in the 70s was this idea of woman as other. And I'm not, I'm not sure how familiar you are or not with Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, but that was sort of her main point, was that there was, in every society there is a one, there's a subject, and then there's like the other that is set up in opposition to that. And that, women traditionally have played that role. And, one of the things that feminism did was to explore the other as an equal voice to the subject, so that you had an alternative voice that had an equal reality. One of the things that was really interesting that Judy Chicago did was she felt that art education for women had really suppressed women's true instincts. So she felt like women would go to art school, and that at that point all studio art teachers were males, so she felt that they would sort of suppress women and then not let them sort of develop their own content. So what she did was take this group of women students and have them use a bunch of exercises like consciousness raising, journaling, different sorts of exercises to find their own content and to take material, no matter how trivial, even it could be lipstick, or I had a bad day, or I burped, or whatever, and to use that no matter how ridiculous it was, you could use that as the formation of art. And so there was an installation called Woman House that this group of women put together using this material and their imagination and their associations with, the house, the home, their childhood. For example, this was the Nurturant Kitchen, which had on the walls these shapes that were they were like fried eggs, but they were also breasts simultaneously. So there were all this sort of fantasy, deep resources. In the 80s, a lot of male artists returned to figuration, which were ideas that women had developed to some disdain in the 70s. Eric Fischl is a painter that was very, widely celebrated in the 80s, and he was at Cal Arts at the same time as Woman House, and he's acknowledged that seeing Woman House helped him develop this new material about, sexuality, male sexuality, his childhood. So works like this Sleepwalker and this, Bad Boy, these were all things that he acknowledges that he was influenced by seeing Woman House. And he cited in particular this work by Judy Chicago, Menstruation Bathroom in Woman House. A couple of points that I want to make, just also that, that women's art that also had effects in other ways. This idea of otherness began to be used for other sectors besides women. So it began to be applied to race, as in the work of Adrienne Piper, who did this work, The Mythic Being, where she dressed up as a black working class male and, began to deal with that as a confrontation. And then there was also just finally, the idea of the malleability of gender and gender as performance, which a lot of women artists began to explore, that gender is not an unchangeable essence, but it's something that can be, it's a performance, it's a kind of performance. The idea also of of the criticality of art, that art adapting a sort of critical, deconstructive idea was something that was ushered in by women's art. You know, the idea of the male gaze, that the gaze has a gender to it, and women beginning to sort of deconstruct that and look at what that kind of content is within art. So my point being that a lot of the types of work that are done today, the kind of criticality of the image, the art of identity politics, art about identity, about place, a lot of that has its roots in this work at that time. It was all done by these amazing women, many of which are in this image. So that's it.